Welcome back. I wanted to just offer a little bit of a supplement to what I hope you just finished watching, which is Dr. Cinnamon's lecture on the history of education in America. Something you should know about me is, and maybe some of you do, maybe I've already made this clear and I can't recall it, but I used to be a history teacher. And before that, I was a history major. I loved history when I was in school, but not in the way that like inspired me to be a history major. I became a history major because frankly, I was a little bit at loose ends as an undergrad. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And then I took my first college level history class. And what I realized was, for me, history was really about knowing myself better, understanding why things were the way they were. History, I would always tell my students, is less of a pursuit in understanding the past and more of a pursuit of understanding the present in this moment. If I could remake the world, I would require every single undergraduate educator to take several history classes in the history of the field. And in graduate school, we should follow up with an even higher level of learning, right? But because there's just so much to know, and because, as I always like reinforce to you guys, teaching and teachers' professional development is so under-resourced and so underappreciated in the modern day. Here we are. Most teachers, if you ask them the history of their field, know very, very little. So what you guys just watched in Dr. Cinnamon's lecture, I hope not only enriched what you already knew, but also made you curious about what is out there to know. Because obviously in a lecture like that, an online lecture from a really prestigious member of the history faculty at a great American university, obviously she can't tell you everything, but she can tell you the beats. So I wanted to step in and do a little bit of a supplementary video to address a few things that I consider, as a historian, as an educator, as a scholar, the things that I consider to be particularly important for what we are going to talk about and what we are talking about in terms of equity and justice in schools. So I'm going to just direct you to the slides that she talked about, and I'm just going to do a little bit of additional information. I don't have additional slides, but I would encourage you to take notes, sort of maybe right alongside the notes that you took with Dr. Cinnamon's lecture, and maybe just create a little box or a column that sort of articulates that this is information that is coming from this little supplementary lecture here. I'll try not to go on and on too much, but man, you guys, this stuff is so crazy. Before I start, let me say this too. There's a lot of things you can read to build your knowledge of the history of our field. And believe me, the more you know about the history of this field too, the more people will listen, because it's surprising to a lot of people. Oh, when you tell them some of these things. One of the most, I think the best books that I've read of a modern writer writing about this actually comes from an author named Dana Goldstein. She's not a historian, she's a journalist, but she wrote a book called Teacher Wars, and I think it's called like The History of America's Most Embattled Profession. It's awesome, it's comprehensive, but it's pre-pandemic. So there really isn't additional context for what has been happening over the last 3 to 4 years. And as we all know, that pandemic changed so much of what we do, how we think, and also really ushered in many ways this new era of anti-diversity and equity movements, anti-CRT, these sort of parents' rights movements that we are seeing so intensely, and also this movement towards this white nationalist rejection of an American public secular education system. So I would encourage you to do some additional research on that too, and I will continue to kind of try to update you guys and give you some material on that. But I would start, if you're interested in this stuff, with Dana Goldstein. Her book is fantastic. So I want to direct your attention. We're not going to talk too much about colonial history. That's all very good, very interesting. And I would say my overview kind of commentary on that is, this was a time when school was for certain kids, right? For wealthy, elite families, maybe the gentry could afford to pay for private tutors or could enroll their children in private schools. The British did have a system where more students were allowed in. Nevertheless, access to university education and higher education was strictly controlled. And it was strictly controlled by the Catholic Church in most places, or the church in England, the Church of England, other institutions like that. So churches and these kinds of institutions used to be heavily influential in the way that schools worked. But right around the time of Horace Mann and the Common Schools movement, so we're talking about the end of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, this huge movement began to create a common school system that would have an opportunity to educate all children, which we probably all reflect on and think like, that's so great. Thank goodness we did that. Thank goodness it wasn't just kids like Thomas Jefferson who got an education. That's one thing I want to just deconstruct for a hot second, is when we look back and think about the sort of founding fathers from an American context, but I think my Canadian students will recognize that term, right? And the people that I mean by that. And then apply in the Canadian context and other international contexts in Australia and other places, we have these sort of great wise men that we think of as having founded these nations in, sometimes the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, when we're talking about modern nations. But why did those men have an opportunity to do that? Because they were white, especially in a European context, in an American context, that was critical, a Western context. And they were from families where their labor was not required to actually feed the family. And in addition, the family had extra money to pay for food for that child to eat while it was in school, or to attend a school and pay a fee, or to hire a private tutor, right? So the Common Schools movement comes as a response to that. Horace Mann, as you heard Dr. Cinnamon talk about, was a true believer in this idea of education for all. But I want to put a little bit more context to Horace Mann in terms of his relationship with abolition and his relationship with Catherine Beecher. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, you may recall, especially those of you who remember like English class, when we would read the readings of the abolitionists. And Harriet Beecher Stowe was an abolitionist who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a wild success. Modern literary critics will point out that it wasn't as revolutionary as many of us sort of were led to believe when we were younger, that it was nevertheless a really popular book that portrayed, particularly to white, sort of moderate Americans in the North, this version of slavery that was in some ways romanticized, and it allowed these abolitionists, these white abolitionists in the North, to sort of play on the emotions to convince others like them that an end to slavery was moral, Christian, just. Okay, so I bring that up because Catherine, her sister, was also an abolitionist and was also engaged in this work. Though Catherine chose a different route than Harriet, she joined Horace Mann. And so I want to reinforce to you that the modern American historical narrative around schools really does start with this abolitionist root. And so as we kind of bookend and think where we are now with this equity movement and all of this like sort of sustained harm that schools have done, it shouldn't escape us that we have been working on this project for a long time. And when you are working on a project for a really long time and you don't seem to be getting very far, sometimes it's important to go back and ask yourself, well, how did this start, right? So the idea was to create a common school system for all kids in the US. But an important point is that, and this is where I want to make sure I add a little bit of context here, especially when we talk about gender and gender equity in schools. Because one of the important points that Goldstein and others have pointed out in their work is that in order to do this, they had to make schools and school systems affordable for small local communities. And how do you make it affordable? Well, the largest expense, ongoing expense for any school is going to be the teachers. It still is, right? People often say, I get super annoyed when I hear people say, well, I mean, you know, schools are expensive. We can't afford to raise teachers' salaries. And I just want to be like, but the teachers are the main product. You can take everything away in schools except for the teachers, and we can still function, right? You guys have all been in situations where the internet goes out and you can still do it, right? So teachers are the expense because teachers are the primary subject movers within those spaces. Okay, so back to Horace Mann. So how are you going to convince a small town in northern Michigan, a small town in Southern California, to pay for a teacher? Teachers at that time were considered to be expensive. So Horace Mann and Catherine Beecher embarked on an ambitious plan to recruit, train, and convince communities to hire young women, with the explicit and stated intention of creating a workforce of teachers that was cheap and who could be easily controlled. Because young women were, of course, disempowered in society at that time. They had very limited professional opportunities, educational opportunities. And so, and yet there were lots of young women who were seeking opportunity, especially as new immigrants were coming into the US and other parts of the colonized world. And so you have this situation where these young women are being sort of like lured into this profession with these hopes of this promise of a great career, and it was for them a great career, but they were specifically recruited so they could be paid less. And in addition to that, a hierarchy was established within schools and made really rigid that established the principal. What many people don't realize is that the history of the principal, the job principal, comes again out of this period. Principals, there used to be this concept in English common schools called the principal teacher. Like the leader of the school was just the teacher who had been there the longest. But what Harriet Beecher and Horace Mann did was, again, for the sake of sort of convincing these communities to hire these cheap young women, that don't worry mayors, don't worry town councils, don't worry anybody. We're going to put a man in charge. Even though the girls are going to run the school, we're going to put a man in charge of actually running the school. And that is who you will talk to. And he is the principal teacher, or what we now think of as the principal. Now, our hierarchies have grown and they continue to deepen in the modern world, which I have some critique of, as you could probably imagine. Nevertheless, this is the origin of it, right? It actually has its origins in this sort of economizing of schools and also of this gendered oppression. So the field, in many ways, you could argue, is really built on an oppressive labor condition for women. Okay, but also I want to talk about the industrialized world. And when we move into the next slide, she's talking about it, and Dr. Cinnamon did a great job of talking about this, but I really want you to think about, so as these schools move into the 20th century, what we see is industrialization in schools, where schools are now actually running like factories, very intentionally being run by factories. I want you to take a second, and I want you to think of every system in your school that is extremely similar to a system that might run in a factory or any mechanized workplace. For example, the bells, departments, right? Siloing off different topics, right? Experts, sort of specialists in one area versus the other, especially in secondary education. Not only that, we have this standardization. Everybody gets the same, right? It's what makes educating everybody possible. That's sort of the idea. We also have this mass assessment and sort of mass curriculum that is applied to everyone. Everyone judged kind of on the same metric with no real sense of geographic or context differences. And also rules and discipline that are focused on students being on time, students completing their classes and moving through the curriculum at a very regimented pace. Think about the grading and the way that, and when I mean grading, I mean like grades that we create, aging of students in these sort of rigid ways. So the mechanization of schools and the way that systems are worked, as you start sort of unpacking how systems contribute to inequalities in our schools, this is a really critical element, is this industrialization. Willis is an author who in the 1970s wrote a book called Learning to Labor. And in that book, he argues that not only do systems replicate sort of factory conditions, but he argued that there was something called social reproduction at work in schools, where schools were actually set up and enacting this reproduction cycle where the leadership, the structures, the curriculum, the rules was so tightly modeled on the factory that in fact schools were operating to just create workers. I still bristle when I hear people talk about school and school to work initiatives. You'll often hear people, especially in my home state, we had a governor who was very conservative, and this was a number of years ago, but Scott Walker was his name, and Governor Walker talked endlessly about school to work, right? And it's a very common and very popular, especially economically conservative, socially conservative theme around schools, that schools should be operating to actually drive students into the workforce. This is an invention. This is not something that was sort of necessarily innate and inherent. I think of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's education was not focused on getting Thomas Jefferson into schools. When we think of the Enlightenment and the men of the Enlightenment, and women, we don't talk about the women of the Enlightenment as much, but let's acknowledge that those silenced women absolutely were there as well. But regardless, we don't talk about the job they are being educated to do. We talk about the big ideas that they are famous for. But in this time period, right, in that industrial era up through the 1970s and even in today, this notion of school to work is again a sort of sociologists would frame it as this tool being used to actually continue the capitalist kind of structure of getting kids into the workforce. So that's a critical approach to thinking about those kinds of structures. And if you think about the way schools still work in terms of gender, class, race, what we see in these sort of industrialized and into sort of mid-century models of schooling is that they are replicating racial segregation, they are replicating class segregation, they are replicating gendered oppressions in the same way that we see those out in the real world. Okay, I am going to take a break here because I see we're rounding up on about 18 minutes on this video. So I will do the second half of my thoughts in just a few minutes or in the next video. What am I saying? Okay, bye.